Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Welcome to the Space Policy Show. I am so excited to have Josef Koller, our video producer, and George Nield with me today. They will be talking about space growing faster when it's safer, safety, and sustainability. A little bit about Josef. Josef is a systems director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. He serves as a senior analyst and team leader on topics that cut across policy, technology, and economics. A little bit into our talk, Josef will be introducing George. Just a couple of reminders. You can find us on aerospace.org/policy. We're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. We would love for you to join the chat. Go ahead, click the little icon to the right, type in your name, hit enter, ask your questions, give us feedback. And we're so excited to get started. Josef, I guess over to you.
Hi, Rebecca, and thanks everybody online watching the Space Policy Show. This definitely has been an interesting time adopting our lifestyle to working from home, and many meetings and conferences being canceled, like the Space Symposium in Colorado. And so the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation, we wanted to provide an opportunity to engage with our friends and colleagues in the space policy community. And so we came up with this idea of starting the Space Policy Show. It was definitely quite an interesting learning experience for many of us. For example, my home has been turned into a live production webinar studio where I cut between different audio streams and camera views from cameras that are distributed all over the country because our colleagues are also working from home. And so in our first episode, we had a power failure in my neighborhood that cut our first live stream short. So I apologize for that. And I really appreciate everybody coming back to watch this episode. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to just briefly set the stage, provide a couple of observations before we begin. And so let me just briefly talk to what I see currently is going on. If you go out and look at or listen to keynote addresses of senior government officials, or officials from companies, space is often still referred to as the Wild West. And so there's this notion out there. And the question is, why is that, and what's deriving from it? Another observation that I make is that today the regulators are trying to move more from prescriptive to performance-based rules. So let me give you briefly an example of what I mean by that. So a prescriptive rule is, for example, if a regulator were to require you to use a particular type of tubing up to a certain pressure, that is, of course, would be very simple for the regulator then to just check the box and you're in the all clear. On the other hand, it also squelches innovation, and it doesn't let companies come up with their own innovative ideas and how to achieve a specific goal. And today our presentation is about spaceflight safety. An example that this is happening today, the shift from a prescriptive to a more performance-based rule. I want to highlight the recent publication from the FCC on upcoming rulemaking. And so it talks very specifically about satellite size. And if your satellite is above a nominal size, you're deemed trackable, or your satellite is deemed trackable. If you fall below a specific size, you would need to provide additional information, and then your license is looked at on a case-by-case basis. So this is an example of how regulators are moving from more prescriptive to more performance-based rules. Another point I want to make here is that the industry, looking at these trends, space being the Wild West and regulators moving to more performance-based rules, industry is starting to self-organize. And I believe this is because industry wants to provide a foundation of standards and best practices that work for them, but can also be a foundation for the regulators to implement them into final rulemaking if that were necessary. Another thing I want to discuss briefly today is in about a year ago, Secretary Ross from the Department of Commerce, I think it was in February 2019, he published an op-ed on how to get to a $1 trillion space economy. And he laid out several different items that in how to achieve that $1 trillion economy. And one of those items was to provide a safe space environment. And that's actually the topic for us today. And I just wanted to underscore that a little bit. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to show a quick video, just a couple of seconds, from a trip down on Market Street. This video was taken in 1906 in San Francisco. You can watch the full length online. This was actually taken before the big earthquake. And what you see here is several different traffic participants. You see people walking, you see cars zipping by, horse carriages, a streetcar, and so forth. And it's really traffic pandemonium. Everything's moving left and right. There doesn't seem to be a clear understanding of the rules of the road, so to speak. And the outcome of that is that everything has to move at the lowest common denominator, which is the person walking, or the speed of the person walking. Today, we have a much different environment, and we have sidewalks, we have traffic lanes, we have highways, and this has significantly contributed to the economic development of the country and actually the world, right? That we can now move goods from point A to point B at a very, very efficient speed. And with that, I want to, so the question is, can something like that be, is there an analogy to space? And I want to introduce with that our speaker of today. His name is George Nield, and many of you know him. George has been the former Associate Administrator of the FAA from 2008 to 2018. He was the head of the Commercial Space Transportation Office, and he led numerous initiatives in adapting to this new environment of commercial space launch. And he always had a great interest in spaceflight safety and space traffic management. And so really, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show today, and really appreciate the time that you're spending with us. And over to you, George. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about spaceflight safety. In spite of all of the challenges that we are facing as a society right now, this is a really exciting time in the commercial space community. With all of the ambitious plans and innovative approaches that are being developed, I'm quite sure that if we're able to figure out how to improve the safety, reliability, and sustainability of our space systems, it could significantly accelerate the growth of the global space economy and pay dividends for the United States in terms of national security, technological leadership, economic competitiveness, and our ability to bring the benefits of space down to Earth for use by the general public. Before I talk about some ways we might be able to accomplish that, let's think back to how we got here and then take a look at some of the programs that are already underway. Next chart. Ever since the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into space more than 50 years ago, making him the first human being to leave the planet, almost all of our significant accomplishments and major milestones in space have been achieved by the government. whether we're talking about the X-15 program, Project Mercury, Project Gemini, the Apollo moon landings, 30 years of operating the space shuttle, and then building and living and working on board the International Space Station. It was the government that was responsible for planning, implementing, and executing those space programs. But going forward, that is not necessarily going to be the case, because private industry is playing an increasingly important role in our space activities. Next slide. Just look around. Right now we have Virgin Galactic finishing up its flight test program with Spaceship Two. Very soon they plan to start commercial operations from Spaceport America out in New Mexico, taking people on the adventure of a lifetime to the edge of space. Next chart. Blue Origin also has its own suborbital launch vehicle called New Shepard. They have completed a number of successful test flights without people on board from their West Texas launch site and hope to be able to fly with a person on board later on this year. Next chart. Blue Origin is also working on a much larger reusable rocket called the New Glenn, and they'll be using that to take satellites into orbit. And the first flight for the New Glenn is on the schedule for 2021. Next chart. Meanwhile, SpaceX has had several successful missions of the Falcon Heavy. This is the most powerful rocket in operation today by a factor of 2. It's capable of taking about 140,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. Next chart. SpaceX is also working on something they call the Crew Dragon, and they are hopeful that very soon we will be able to fly American astronauts on an American rocket from American soil and use the Crew Dragon to take NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, and that flight could come up in just the next 1 or 2 months. Next chart. Meanwhile, SpaceX is also developing a very ambitious and very capable reusable rocket called the Starship, and it is designed to be able to take 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit and could be used to take large cargo and many people to the moon or to Mars. That same system is expected to be able to fly hundreds of people from one side of the Earth to the other in less than an hour. So a real game changer. Next chart. Boeing is also working with NASA as part of the Commercial Crew Program. They have their CST-100 Starliner that has already completed 1 test flight, and they expect to be able to conduct another test later on this year. Next chart. United Launch Alliance is working on a replacement for the Atlas V launch vehicle. And their system, which is called the Vulcan, is also expected to fly in 2021. Next chart. And then Northrop Grumman is working on its concept for a next generation launch vehicle. It's called the Omega, and it too is on the schedule for sometime next year. So there's a lot going on in commercial space right now. Next chart. But as this group knows only too well, space is hard. And if you go back and look at the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, you'll find these words: space transportation is inherently risky. I think that is very true. And if you look at the next chart, that's backed up by the numbers. This chart summarizes all of the human space flights that the United States has conducted since the dawn of the space age. And if you add them all up, there's about 380 launches of systems with people on board. And 4 of those have had a tragic ending. 1 X-15, the Space Shuttle Challenger, Space Shuttle Columbia, and one of the Spaceship Two test flights back in 2014. So if you crunch the numbers, you see that the overall US fatal accident rate is approximately 1%, which means that human spaceflight in this country right now is about 10,000 times more dangerous than hopping on a commercial airliner. So we've got some work to do to make space safer. Next chart. It's important to recognize too, though, that spaceflight safety includes more than just human spaceflight. Just in the last several months, we've seen examples of major ground test mishaps, launch vehicle failures, parachute deployment failures, software errors, and on-orbit collisions and close approaches. Next chart. So, what opportunities do we have for improving spaceflight safety? Josef talked about a situation where we have no rules of the road. We have a Wild West environment. That's not what we want. There's an opposite extreme too, though, in which the government has such a bureaucratic framework with red tape and bureaucracy that companies don't feel empowered to be able to try out possible improvements and better ways of doing business. And that just stifles the industry. So the hope is there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle in terms of how we design the regulatory framework. And after thinking about this, I'd like to share several different options that show some promise in terms of being able to tweak that regulatory framework in a way that would be supportive of industry while still improving our spaceflight safety record. And they include things like streamlined regulations, development of standards, guidelines, and best practices, look at commercial human spaceflight, what we can do there, space safety data sharing, and finally, space traffic management. So let's briefly go through each of those areas and talk about what it means. Next chart.
I have a quick question for you. What is space safety data sharing?
So that is the idea of taking information about how systems operate. If you've had accidents or failures or problems or other challenges during your development or during your operations, and making that available outside the company so that other space operators would be able to learn from mistakes. It's certainly important to acknowledge that aerospace is a competitive environment and people are trying to get market share and be the best in the industry and so forth. And I think it's great to compete on seat size or the cost of checking your luggage or how good you are at sticking to the schedule. But I don't think we want to compete on safety. We would like everyone to operate in a safe way. And we can do that by sharing safety information so that each company doesn't have to make the same mistakes as it goes through the development process.
Thank you, George.
All right. So looking at one of these areas, streamlined regulations, in May of 2018, the White House issued Space Policy Directive 2 to streamline regulations for commercial launches and reentries. And one of the stated objectives of that directive was to replace many of the prescriptive regulations that we have in the books today with performance-based rules. Now, the FAA published a notice of proposed rulemaking in April of 2019 and invited public comment on that. And they got more than 150 responses, but many of those were rather critical of what had been put out there. There was at least some sense that some of the provisions in the proposed regulations were even more prescriptive or more detailed or more burdensome than what we have on the books today. It turns out that it's pretty difficult to write a good set of performance-based regulations. So next chart. One of the ideas that's being talked about more these days is the concept of a safety case methodology. We don't see that a lot in the US in aerospace, but it has been adopted by the United Kingdom, its Ministry of Defense, as well as some other industries like offshore oil drilling and nuclear power. It starts with a voluntary audit of the applicant's safety and risk management program, and then proceeds where the applicant develops a safety case that contains evidence in the form of engineering analysis or test data that demonstrate how public safety would be protected. Next chart. Another area that I think has potential is the development of standards, guidelines, and best practices. There's a lot of thinking that voluntary industry consensus standards would allow industry a lot more flexibility in being able to try new things, incorporate advanced technologies, and different ways of doing business. Now, there have been several attempts to implement such a program. Right now, for example, the Commercial Spaceflight Federation is working with ASTM on the development of standards, but we haven't seen a lot of progress to date. And I think the reason for that is that the standard development organizations are experts at the process and how this system is supposed to work, but they don't necessarily have the technical expertise to develop the standards themselves. And meanwhile, industry, whom we need to have at the table, has been too busy developing and operating their own systems to be able to devote their best people to this task and give it the right kind of priority. Next chart. Another area with potential for improvement in terms of spaceflight safety is commercial human spaceflight. As many of you know, the FAA is currently under a moratorium that Congress put in place back in 2004, and it would prohibit the issuing of regulations to protect health and safety of crew and spaceflight participants. And that was supposed to last for 8 years, but Congress extended the moratorium in 2012 and then again in 2015. So right now it's scheduled to expire in October of 2023, but they could end up extending it further once we get to that point. My concern is, though, that if in the meantime we had a fatal accident, it would be quite likely that there would be an overreaction to that, and the FAA would be told to immediately put out some regulations to prevent that from ever happening again. And so that is a situation that we don't want to find ourselves in. So I'd like to see us figure out a way to come together now with government, industry, academia, all the experts, and see if we can come up with an improved framework that would allow industry to try new things, but still improve the overall safety of the operations. And if we start now to do that, even though we don't put it into place yet, we could have that ready when the moratorium does expire and be able to do a much smoother transition. Next chart. Next topic is space safety data sharing. Aviation is widely recognized as the safest form of transportation. One of the reasons for that is our history of sharing safety data amongst all of the players in the industry. There's at least two systems that we have in place right now that allow us to do that. One is called ASRS, the Aviation Safety Reporting System. It's a voluntary, confidential, and non-punitive incident reporting system. It's funded by the FAA, and it's administered by NASA. Another system is ASIAS, the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing System, and it combines a lot of different data from a lot of different sources, including internal FAA data, proprietary safety data from the airlines, and manufacturing data. And the minor corporation then takes all of this information, combines it together, de-identifies it in a way to build trust among all the suppliers and enable broad participation and engagement across government and industry. Next chart. So the challenge is that unfortunately right now in the commercial space industry, we see that folks do not tend to share much information in terms of accidents, incidents, mishaps, anomalies, or lessons learned. Companies may not want their competitors to benefit from their mistakes. There may also be a fear that publicizing failures would risk losing future customers or contracts or investments. So as a result, we tend to hold the information close to the vest, and we're not getting the benefit of sharing that we see in aviation. Next chart.
George, let me ask a question. Why do you think it's so important for the space community to cooperate with one another when it comes to safety?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to compete in terms of what services and products you're offering. Again, using the aviation analogy, you can compete based on the comfort and the size of the seat and how many bags you can check and so forth, your on-time record. But we don't want to compete with safety, because we don't want people cutting corners or endangering the users, and because that's going to hurt everybody. If there's a failure in the industry, even if it's in one particular company, that tends to reflect poorly on the entire industry, and you're going to lose business. And it sets up a situation where each company is incentivized to have to make the same mistake over and over again, rather than all learning from one another and having the bar of safety raised for the entire industry.
Great, thank you.
The final area that I think has a lot of potential is space traffic management. As all of you know, space is becoming more and more congested these days. We're seeing the launch of many CubeSats and other small satellites. We also have a number of companies that are in the process of launching mega constellations, which contain hundreds or even thousands of satellites. At the same time, the Department of Defense is attempting to keep track of where everything is in space, but really being a space traffic cop is not part of their core military mission. And there are no universally accepted rules of the road for the safety of space operations. As a result, if we do end up seeing an increase in the number of collisions, that could put astronauts' lives at risk. It could endanger national security spacecraft. It could even make some orbital regimes completely unusable if things get bad enough in the future. Next chart. So over the last several decades, I think it's important to recognize that the DoD has done an admirable job of tracking objects in space and sending out notices about potential conjunctions or collisions. Originally, they were the only ones that had the capability to do the job, but that is no longer the case. We're seeing today that with advances in sensors and more efficient analysis techniques, a significant increase in computational capabilities, there are now several different groups that have demonstrated the necessary capabilities to take on that role, at least on a limited basis. Next chart. So those are some of the areas where I think there's potential for making safety improvements. But the key question is, what can we do to actually enhance safety? And who's in the best position to carry out those responsibilities? Let's start by taking a look at some of the candidates to lead the way. Next chart. It's clear that industry has to be part of this process. They have demonstrated a lot of potential for lower cost, increased innovation, having a greater risk tolerance perhaps than governments tend to, signing up new customers and new markets, and then coming up with new sources of funding and investment. So they have a lot to bring to the table. Next chart. Government too can play an important role. They have lots of smart people with a lot of expertise. They have years of experience on many different space-related programs. And they have and will continue to have a need for space products and services. And after all, the government does have the responsibility for establishing and operating the regulatory framework that we all have to live under. Next chart. I believe that academia also has an important role that they can and should be playing. We look to them for education and training in space-related technical disciplines like propulsion and structures, orbital mechanics, and so forth. I think they also can play an important role, which we haven't fully taken advantage of, in helping our workforce be more knowledgeable about system safety and safety management. Those courses are not typically found in engineering curriculum that you'd see in a college these days. Between professors and students, labs and other facilities, I think universities are in a great position to do space safety related research in terms of expanding the envelope and doing things in new and different ways. And then finally, we're relying on academia to provide us with the workforce of the future. Going to have to come up with people who are knowledgeable and experienced and motivated to step in from day one and be contributors to the aerospace industry. Next chart. So I'm a big believer in synergy and partnerships. I would love to see if there's a way to bring the best of government, industry, and academia all together and see if we can work together to improve spaceflight safety. So how would we go about doing that? Next chart. One idea that's being talked about now is to see if we can set up something that we're calling a Space Safety Institute. That would be a nonprofit, public-private partnership whose purpose would be to provide space safety expertise and support to both government and industry. Participation would be open to all interested stakeholders, including vehicle operators and developers, insurance underwriters, professional society representatives, researchers, and academia. Now, it could be administered by a university, a nonprofit association, or an FFRDC, which could also provide subject matter experts on an as-needed basis. Next chart. So how could a Space Safety Institute enhance safety? Well, let's take a look at each of those general areas that we talked about earlier and see what the role of a Space Safety Institute would be. For streamlined regulations, you will recall we talked about the idea of having a safety case methodology. If a Space Safety Institute were in place, that could be the knowledgeable, objective, third-party auditor that could be evaluating the safety cultures and safety management systems at these companies and actually evaluate the safety case proposals. And that way provide some helpful feedback back to the industry and provide help and advice and assessments to the government regulators. In the areas of standards, guidelines, and best practices, you've got a collaborative framework all set up. And so I think that would allow us to make a lot faster progress on developing standards, because you could use some of that cadre of space experts sitting around the table to draft up those safety standards and then allow industry to provide feedback and critique those proposed standards without waiting for industry to do the whole job themselves in between parts of their programs when they have people that can be made available. In the area of commercial human spaceflight, again, Space Safety Institute could be the facilitator that brings all the parties together and lays out, starting with a clean sheet of paper, what that new regulatory framework could look like. It could be based on performance-based regulations and include the safety case approach for those who would like to take advantage of that. It could refer to industry consensus standards as a means of satisfying the regulatory requirements. And I think that would allow us to make a lot faster progress on that whole endeavor so that when we do get to the end of the moratorium, then we're ready to transition to the new framework. Next chart. Because of its independence and its collaborative mission, Space Safety Institute would be in a perfect position to be able to create and then manage a system that would collect and disseminate information on space-related accidents, incidents, anomalies, close calls, and lessons learned. And I think that would be a tremendous help in raising the bar in terms of safety, and allow us to help one another and to learn from one another as we do these difficult missions in space. Finally, in the area of space traffic management, I think the Space Safety Institute would be in a great position to be able to operate a public-private partnership as part of a whole-of-government effort, along with industry, academia, and the international community, to provide a civil space traffic management system with products and services. And such an organization could directly support a lead federal agency when that is selected, and allow the entire community to participate in this very important job of increasing space safety. Next chart. So to wrap up, given the importance that space has in our life today, with national security, economic, and impacts to our everyday life, I think it's going to be crucial for the United States to do all that it can to ensure the safety of space operations and the preservation of the space environment. And establishing a Space Safety Institute as a public-private partnership would allow government, industry, and academia to collaborate in achieving that objective. I'd be happy to answer any questions if we have any.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, George. We do have some questions. So the first question I want to ask you is, where would the funding for the Space Safety Institute come from?
I think there's several options available. Some funding could come from congressional appropriations through the government departments and agencies that are benefiting from the Space Safety Institute. So the FAA, Commerce, NASA, FCC, the Air Force, and the Space Force. The Space Safety Institute, I think, could also offer training and research support to organizations that would be willing to pay for such services. And in addition, the Space Safety Institute could provide independent assessments, safety audits, and safety case evaluations and other support to industry government or industry customers on an as-needed reimbursable basis.
Okay, great. The next question I have for you is, didn't Space Policy Directive 3 give the Commerce Department responsibility for space traffic management?
So Space Policy Directive 3 did lay out an administration position, and it definitely called for a civil space traffic management program to be implemented to take over from the Department of Defense, but it only recommended that the Department of Commerce be that agency. So if we're really going to do this, Congress has to weigh in, and whatever the lead agency ends up being, Congress is going to need to provide the authority for them to do the job, to collect and to share space safety information on positions of the satellites and so forth, immunity from lawsuits, and then finally the resources to do the job. So because there hasn't been a coming together between the administration and Congress on this issue so far, we're pretty much in limbo right now.
Got it. So how would the government benefit from a Space Safety Institute?
Well, I think a Space Safety Institute would allow a much faster and easier transition to move us from prescriptive regulations to performance-based regulations, which everybody says they want. In theory, at least, government agencies could also accomplish their mission with much smaller staffs, because an office like the FAA wouldn't necessarily have to have, as civil servants assigned to the office, a technical expert on every single discipline in order to be able to thoroughly evaluate the license applications they get from industry. And it also means they don't have to necessarily have the experts on the latest and greatest new technical areas, but instead could draw from this collaborative group of expertise that can provide help and advice. Now, they don't have to abdicate their full responsibilities. They still need to provide oversight and make sure that they're comfortable with the assessments that are being made, but they could rely on the Space Safety Institute basically as a deep bench in terms of technical expertise.
That's great, thank you. So same question, but flip it. So how would the industry benefit from a Space Safety Institute?
I think one of the biggest benefits would be because it would be much more likely to be able to implement this sharing of space safety data. If it's through an SSI, we wouldn't have to worry about the level playing fields and, oh, this is proprietary and this is sensitive and I can't share information and we don't have a contract with you and so forth. But having everybody work together in a way that's collaborative, I think has a lot of potential there. And in addition, this Space Safety Institute would be providing some objective advice and expertise on some challenging issues without industry having to worry that they were making a bad impression on their performance capabilities in their relationship with their government regulator.
Great, thank you. So my last question would be, if you could have one key takeaway that you want your audience to walk away from this talk thinking about, what would that be?
So I'd say that the 1920s are sometimes referred to as the golden age of aviation. And there was plenty of barnstorming and air races and Charles Lindbergh making his non-stop flight across the Atlantic. I would love to see the 2020s someday be referred to as the golden age of commercial space. But this time, instead of daredevil pilots and wing walkers, perhaps we could earn that distinction based on partnerships and collaboration and a renewed focus on improving spaceflight safety through initiatives like the Space Safety Institute. And if we're all willing to work together on it, it just might happen.
Great. Thank you so much, George. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for your patience. I know we experienced the platform crashing unexpectedly. So thank you for those who joined us for the first half. We are going to post this in just a bit. We'll get it out to you. We'll send it to everyone who registered. Just a reminder, we're here every Tuesday, Thursday. So our next episode is Closing the Arctic Infrastructure Gap, National Security and Commercial Considerations, with the lovely Karen Jones and Lena Cashin. So we hope you'll tune in next time. Again, you can find us at aerospace.org/policy. Don't forget, sign up for alerts, sign up for all of our latest and greatest updates. And thanks again.